Hi, I'm Katie Miranda. Welcome to the Palestine Solidarity Telesummit. Today I'm here with Cindy and Craig Corrie, who are Rachel Corrie's parents. The opportunity to interview them is very significant for me because Rachel's murder in 2003 by an Israeli soldier driving a bulldozer in Gaza directly affected the course of my life. And what I mean by that is that this is the first time that I had heard of the international solidarity movement. And 2 years after that, I joined them in the West Bank. So I'd like to welcome Craig and Cindy to the Telesummit.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Can you tell us about the aftermath of Rachel's death, both in the US and in Israeli politics, and what happened with your Israeli court case?
The aftermath of Rachel's death is, it's an enormous memory for us. It was the most terrible, dramatic thing that had happened in our lives. She was killed right as the Iraq War was starting. And so immediately in the United States, it was just a few days before the start of the Iraq War, but Craig and I went on the evening after we got the news to Washington, D.C. Our son lived there, and we knew we needed help. We didn't know what we were going to need to do in order to return Rachel's body to the United States. So we went there, and we were immediately supported by Rachel's congressman, Brian Baird, who was from Washington State. And we found ourselves just the day or two after she was killed in Congress, in the halls of Congress, meeting with Congressman Baird, trying to sort out our next steps, communicating with people at our embassy in Israel while we were sitting in his office. And also, because the Iraq War was starting, taking Rachel's message, or what we thought would be her message, to members of Congress. I couldn't sleep at the time. And I would drift off, and I would feel this jolt go through my arms, and it felt like Rachel saying, "Mom, get up and do something." And I went to a computer and I started to write what I thought she'd want to say, because she had worked so actively against the war in Iraq, even while she was in Gaza, working with children in Gaza and so forth. So I wrote that, and Congressman Baird read it. And then on the Tuesday after she was killed, he said, you can take this. I just said I'd like it to get to her senators. And Craig and I were in North Carolina at the time, so though we had lived in Washington State, they were not our members at the time. So Congressman Baird sent a staff person with us, and we walked around Congress that day delivering what we thought would be Rachel's message to senators in North Carolina and Washington State, also representatives' offices. So and also because of Congressman Baird, his effort, we were able to do a press conference outside the Cannon office building that week as well. So we were plunged into it, and there was immediate interest in this country. But then the Iraq War quickly took Rachel's story out of the mainstream media, and we, we're so new to this. We had not done anything like media work or anything like that before. And I remember sitting in the living room once, or in the back room once we got home to Olympia, to our house here, and our daughter Sarah and our son-in-law were living in our house at the time, and Sarah would help me. And we had requests for radio interviews, and they'd be early in the morning, and Sarah would make notes about things that I might want to remember to mention. So I'd be sitting on the floor in this room talking, to different media across the country and across the world, really. I think our feeling at the time was, this story will be gone so quickly. So we have to do exactly, as much as we can to call for accountability and to explain to people what happened, explain to people why Rachel was there. And, we thought it would disappear. And then, in some ways it did, but in many other ways it did not. It attracted a lot of interest. And so we just kept taking the next step. And within Israel, we heard more about what was going on there through ISM activists and through our supporters there. I think what was so heartening to us is that we did have support there, that Rachel had support there. And there were ads placed in Haaretz by people who mourned her, by Israeli Jews who mourned her. And we were receiving messages from different parts of Israeli society as well, and Palestinians, of course, from all over the world. My AOL account at the time crashed in the first day. Somehow the address got out. And I think there were over 10,000 emails at the time. Fortunately, my son was good at technology, and he set us up so that we could continue to get communication. Mm-hmm. But I really didn't even see some of that for some weeks. My sisters started to read through it and so forth. And Craig would probably have more to add about.
Well, I think, it was overwhelming in those first weeks. Yes, the mainstream media paid attention right at the beginning, and we never looked back. We still don't, I think, look back at what happens in terms of media or whatever. But I do remember that people telling me that, a lot of newspapers covered it, of course, both locally in Olympia and in Charlotte where we were living, but around the country and around the world. And that brought a lot of attention to us, which was difficult, as you can imagine. Actually, our daughter Sarah found out about Rachel through a friend that alerted her that she'd seen it on the news on TV. And Sarah wondered why we had not called her, and then she realized that it's because we didn't know. So Sarah called us, and then. I didn't want the rest of the family, particularly my mother, who was in her late 80s, to find out that way. So I called Rachel's brother in D.C. and told him, and I called my sister to try to tell her to get somebody to tell my mother, and let the family know, because it was clearly out on the news immediately, and before there was any facts and for hours, if not really the whole time. The State Department, for instance, was following the news reports rather than knowing anything more. They were helpful to us in those first few hours, certainly. And like I say, Congressman Baird, like Cindy said, Congressman Baird was immediately helpful to us as soon as he found out. But that was later on that first day. I think there were a few things that I can't forget about some of those first messages that Cindy talked about in email. I remember an email from Bernie in Chicago, and he said, my half-sister was killed in the Holocaust, and now I live the rest of my life for two Rachels, your daughter and my half-sister. Aww. And, of course, since then, we've had, countless Jews and Israelis and people from all over the world in every walk of life. But that outreach from a person I don't think I've ever met, I certainly hadn't at the time. I haven't knowingly met Bernie from Chicago. But that outreach at that moment was incredibly important to us and reassuring. So that brought us forward, and because we were trying to find out facts about this, our son, it was the Sunday when Rachel was killed, and our son managed to figure out how to call into the State Department, and then he called us back and said, well, they're just watching it on TV like we are. They don't know anything. And he was the one that could be active and really do things to get us up to his house in the D.C. area, expecting to go to Israel to pick up her body. And so we started with the government, like Cindy said, walking around there, and we were engaged with our government throughout this process. really, through that would have been the W. Bush first administration, and of course we went on with the Obama administration after that, and we've been working on that, and I was wondering what the State Department, for instance, would how they'd try to influence us. By the time we actually got into the State Department in a conference room with Colin Powell's Chief of Staff, Lawrence B. Wilkerson, I thought that by that time we were walking through the halls of Congress quite a bit, and we were on radio and TV, and they knew that. And I thought, well, they may try to advise us to do something differently. And they never did. And in fact, Larry Wilkerson told my daughter Sarah and me later, said, "You're doing exactly what you need to do." But he said, "You may never see results." And he said, "Don't lose your health, but keep doing this if you can." But the State Department did things for us personally, but they never did enough to press this forward. They never got anything that looked like, or even at certain levels of the State Department, that they thought was independent or valid investigation, credible investigation from the Israelis. President Bush was promised a thorough, credible, and transparent investigation into Rachel's killing with a report to be made to the U.S. government. And they had a military investigation. There was a report that came out of that, but the government had to press very, very hard to get that revealed to them, but not given to them. So they were able to read a copy and take notes, and eventually our family was able to read a copy and take notes of that. But we weren't given a copy of it. We weren't given a direct document. And even the State Department found and pointed out to us inconsistencies in that report. And then over the years, we found even more inconsistencies in that report. So after 2 years, to keep pushing this forward, the only way that I think an individual family can push that forward and have control over that is through a lawsuit. And so we sued the Israeli government, not the soldier that was driving the bulldozer, but the Israeli military and the government in Israel to, in terms of try to get an accounting of the killing of our daughter. And as our daughter Sarah keeps pointing out, a lawsuit can't replace a valid investigation. So we were able to get a lot of documents out of the Israeli military. We were able to bring their witnesses into court and hear their testimony. The court, we had to file that within 2 years of Rachel's killing, and we were a day early on that. So that would have, Rachel was killed on March 10th, 2003. We filed on March 9th of 2005. It finally went to court. The first day in court was it March 10th? And I may have said she was killed on March 10th. It's March 16th. But I think the first day of court was March 10th of 2010, and the court proceedings ended on July 10th, 2011. The judge gave his opinion in late August of 2012. So that's that alone in the lower court proceedings was almost a decade of our lives. And there were many days in court, but they were spread out. They don't have only the judge hears the hearings, so there's no need for them to gather all the hearings together at one time like you would with a jury. And the judge said that he had no reason to take our plight of being in a foreign country or having to fly back and forth into account when he set the hearing dates. And so we were left, and it was a blessing in a way, an expensive blessing, but we were forced to stay in Haifa off and on for probably 9 months for ourselves, and our daughter Sarah, who was there with us, couldn't travel so easily, so she was probably there a year. That gave us a lot of time to move easily in and out of the West Bank, to make a lot of friends in Haifa among the Israelis as well as the Palestinians, and give us some sort of feel, even though we don't understand languages, for those communities. And I don't regret that for an instant. But of course, in the end, the judge found that it was Rachel's fault that she was killed. And we appealed that to their high court. And I believe the findings of that came out, you're going to have to remind me of when that happened, September of
2014.
2014. So, and in that, astoundingly, the high court said that international law does not apply to Israel's actions in the Gaza Strip. And that was signed on by 3 of their high court judges, including the chief judge of the high court. So there's, I think most of us that watch Israel-Palestine have known that they pay no attention to international law.
Right.
But to have their high court actually repudiate it, even though they signed those treaties, was astounding to me. So that, in a nutshell, there's a whole lot about the trial. I mean, you really ask us about 15 years of our lives. And, so it's hard, but there's a whole lot about the trial that brought up incredible inconsistencies. And I will say that at the end of that trial, when the lower court brought out its findings, we did make it back into the mainstream media. I do remember on that day there was a moment in which Cindy was facing one way on the streets of Haifa, talking to BBC, and I was facing the other way, talking to CNN. So we were able to get that back out into the mainstream media, and we had support from the UN, written support from the UN, and a written statement for Jimmy Carter and the Carter Center in support of us. So I think that while we didn't prevail in court, what our attorney, Hussein Abu Hussein, an Palestinian Israeli, was able to do was show that the courts are a part of the occupation there in Israel.
Now you guys founded the Rachel Corrie Foundation, and what is the mission of the Rachel Corrie Foundation, and how are you keeping Rachel's legacy alive? You might want to talk a little bit about the play. Is the play still being performed?
Well, first, the Rachel Corrie Foundation was founded almost 15 years ago now, because people kept sending gifts to us, monetary gifts, and we needed to find a way to do something with them. And we had the experience of connecting with Linda Beale, whose daughter had been killed in South Africa. We met her 2 weeks after Rachel was killed, and her daughter had been trying to register South African voters, and she was killed. She was mistaken for being Afrikaner and was killed. And the Beales participated in the Truth and Reconciliation process and started a foundation in South Africa. So, as I said, we were just taking the next step day by day, and we thought, well, okay, we'll try to start an organization of some kind. So the Rachel Corrie Foundation had its beginnings here in our community. It's now grown to we have a small office, we have a small staff, but very passionate people working to carry on Rachel's work, and in the spirit in the spirit that she left with us. And we work on education, we work on connections, building connections, on supporting grassroots activism, and on working for peace through use of art and the written word, because all of those were things very important to Rachel. And of course, she connected us to the people of Gaza, to the people of Palestine, and that's our primary focus. But more and more, we're all seeing the intersections between all of these social justice issues here in our own country and around the world, and the impact of U.S. foreign policy through all these years on communities around the world. And so I think there's more and more room for us to make those connections through the foundation, and I think Rachel would have wanted us to do that, because certainly she had broad interests as well. But Israel-Palestine is our focus. We do conferences, events. We're supportive of BDS, and we're working right now to support the Friends of Sabeel campaign of Hewlett-Packard Free Churches. And we have projects in Gaza that are very important to us, that are that were created, initiated by our friends in Gaza, and we continue to work with them, to partner with them, to make those as effective as possible. We're not a humanitarian organization. We don't have the capacity to be one, and our intent is not to do anything that kind of enables the occupation, but to follow the lead of our Palestinian friends on the ground there, with to follow their ideas. So we've supported arts activities. There's the Gaza Sports Initiative, and we're just always listening to them about what is needed, and to the best of our ability, we try to support that. The play. My name is Rachel Corrie. I'm glad you asked me about that today, because one of the people who was very instrumental in that play happening, and then bringing our family into that process, is a woman named Elise Dodgson, and she died this past week. She was in her 70s. She was working for the Royal Court Theater. She traveled all over the world and spent a lot of time in Palestine with Palestinian writers, authors, and playwrights. And her work was to take to go to places where people had stories to tell, and then to encourage and to help them move that into theater. And that's certainly what happened with the play My Name is Rachel Corrie. The actor Alan Rickman, his partner and wife, eventually Rima, was very political, and she read Rachel's emails in The Guardian. And then she took those to Alan, and she said, look at this writing. And he took it to the Royal Court Theater and said, we need to try to see if we can do something. And the Royal Court works with new projects, new writers, and so forth. And so they contacted our family. It was a long process, but eventually out of that, and out of their care, and out of the care of Elise, who was kind of assigned to us, I think, but there were phone calls and emails before we ever met her, but she was remarkable. We all became close friends and like family, creating that play, and they made sure that we were there to see the productions that happened in London, which were very successful. And then the play eventually came to the U.S. after some controversy initially, but again, the Royal Court helped us through that whole situation. And the play, yes, has continued. It's been on every continent, Craig says, except Antarctica. It's been translated into many languages, and we continue to get notifications that the play is about places where the play is still happening. And just this past year, it happened here in Olympia again. We had never had a local production. A Seattle production had come here and was performed at the Evergreen State College years ago. And there had been a traveling production that came through one time for just a single performance. But this was a full run of a month of performances here in Olympia. And it was quite remarkable because we would go and sit in the audiences. And I think one thing for us to really remember as activists is that we sometimes think people know about all these things. But even here in our community, there were people who were really learning about Rachel and about the story and about some of the subtleties of her story for the very first time. It was very powerful to hear. It's a wonderful gift to our family.
So you've been very involved in Palestine solidarity activism since then. Can you tell us what strategies or initiatives are working in the movement for Palestinian rights here in the U.S.?
I think the most important one is BDS, so boycott, divestment, and sanctions. So many people probably that'll see this are familiar with that strategy. It was called upon by the Palestinian people and their civil society back in, what year was that, Cindy?
2005.
2005. So yeah, it's more than a decade old. But the people that are shaping that and pushing that out of Palestine worked with the same projects with South Africa. And that's really the way I think of it. So you're trying to boycott goods, so an economic boycott there. Divest, and that's really so you're selling stock that you might own in various companies that profit from this. So basically saying I won't profit from the suffering of others, and then trying to get your government to sanction what it does, to stop supporting Israel when it's using the sport. And of course, in the U.S., that would be wonderful. Our government is going the opposite direction, sadly, but that'd be a wonderful thing to do because it's our support that's making that happen. Cindy and I have talked about this for instance, at our state legislature and a lot of states around the country. There's, in fact, probably most of them, there's introduced some sort of legislation to try to make working on BDS illegal, or in somehow punishing people that do that, or speaking about it, particularly on college campuses. It's a real problem. It's very clear in U.S. law that boycotts are a form of legal protest. It's free speech. And I was reminded in a court here in Olympia, talking about a boycott that was going on in our local cooperative, that by the judge, that was saying we have a rich history of that. And I thought, oh yeah, there was something about a Tea Party once, wasn't there? And it, of course, goes on from there. So our country's actually started with boycotts. The other thing I try to remind people about is that this strategy was used with South Africa, and it did not destroy South Africa. It saved South Africa. A lot of work remains to be done in South Africa, but that wouldn't be possible. It wouldn't be. It simply would not be a part of the world of governments had it not been for the outside strategy of boycotts, divestments, and sanctions. So I don't feel at all when we work on that we're working against Israel, frankly. We're working against the apartheid that they've adopted in their society over there. And our Israeli friends tell us that they need that outside help, just like South Africa did.
I just wanted to mention that the emphasis on elevating Palestinian voices, I think, is so important. And I just had an opportunity to hear from Mohammed Sabana, the cartoonist, Palestinian cartoonist from Jenin, who's doing a tour in the U.S. And I see the impact that hearing from him, seeing his talent and seeing how he's challenging the occupation through his art, how that impacts audiences and people who aren't as familiar with the issues as we have. So I think bringing those voices forward in any way that we can continues to be so important. And emphasizing youth. I've started working with another group here with the United Church of Christ, who are trying to do more work on identifying materials for youth curriculums, and I'm reminded, that this has been going on for decades and decades, and that the education of young people coming up from preschool through high school and college is so important, because those of us with this gray hair aren't going to be around to do all of that work in the same way for a lot longer. And of course, we all want it to be solved soon. But the reality is that we're probably going to need advocates for Palestine for some time. So I think the emphasis on youth is really, really important.
You mean educating young people here in the U.S.?
Yes, I do think educating people, yeah, and determining how to do that, in ways that make it possible for public school teachers, private school teachers, churches, and everyone to look at this, to let their youth and children look at this issue, looking at all dimensions of it.
I think we've come a long, long ways in changing the discourse in this country about Israel and Palestine. When Rachel was killed, and throughout my life up until that point, if you talk to somebody on the street, they just really say horrible things about Palestinians and totally side with the Israelis. That was the only narrative we knew you could imagine another narrative because what we were hearing was kind of implausible, but that took more imagination than most of us would have. Now I remember talking to somebody on the street not that long ago who said, well, I don't know anything about it, but I think there's something really wrong with what Israel's doing there. I think we've changed the narrative. We changed a lot of the discussion on the street. We have not changed U.S. policy. That's our next goal.
What actions taken by the international community or people in the U.S. are not working and people should stop doing them?
Well, I mentioned the importance of elevating Palestinian voices and focusing on youth, educating youth. And then kind of the flip side of that for me that I've become aware of lately is that I think it's really important to make room for all the voices. And so while we're really keeping in mind the importance of listening and reaching out to partners intersectionally and hearing from Palestinians and young people, it's still going to take all of us. So I think in the process of doing that, being careful not to lose, not to have those others who've been around for a long time start to feel that there isn't a place for them or that their voices aren't needed or their actions aren't needed. I think we all have to listen and figure out how we can be most effective and what we can contribute, and that's going to change over time for each person. But I think it's just terribly important to make room for all the voices. So it's something that's just been on my mind recently, as I've seen a shift, a wonderful shift, because I see the young generation of Palestinians finding their voices in a way that probably their parents and grandparents weren't able to do. There's less fear and there's determination to speak out, and they're doing it very effectively. The other thing is, that's a hard one, I think, is that there's still division within our movement. There are divisions, and I think they're difficult, and I think they can be damaging. And so I guess I wish that we could find ways to come together and acknowledge that there are some differences, and we are and we aim to be an anti-racist movement opposed to all forms of discrimination. I think we all have to strive for that, and there are questions, I think, about that within the movement. And I think, I think there has to be room for people to make mistakes, and for us to have discussion about those mistakes, and then to figure out how we can move forward. And so that's kind of where I am at this moment on that.
Craig, did you have something to add?
Not so much. I'm glad that Cindy really sort of didn't answer your question, because I think I think there's room for a whole lot that we've done. As a former business person, you sort of measure things by results. And if you look at the occupation, it's pretty easy to say that nothing has worked. And I don't want to be that discouraging. So probably I shouldn't have said it. But what I think is that we don't see what's happening, kind of the way Larry Wilkerson told me, you will never see what you're doing, but the results of it. But it's the thing you need to be doing. And so I think while we need to find even more creative ways to work on this, I do think that we have changed a lot, and that we won't see how everything flips until the moment before it flips. So, if BDS starts to work, the sad part about it is we'll know that it's really working and have a huge impact when Israel can't send people to the World Cup. They can't field a team there, as the sort of stuff happened in South Africa. When it finally gets into something as trivial as sports, we'll know that we're winning. And I think that day will come. And I think when I say we're winning, I'm convinced that that's all people, Israelis, Palestinians, we Americans that care about that. These are kind of dark times, but we have to push through those times. Our voice and our attention right now is on Palestine, but we have a lot of work to do here at home in the course that our country is taking, and just trying to see the other as not as a threat, but as this immense resource and blessing that comes into our life. Those of us that have met a lot of people from around the world are really blessed. We realize how similar they are to us and how their differences are delightful. And it's always a mystery to me that everybody doesn't see people that way. But it seems to be.
That's a really good point. Okay, well, thank you very much, Craig and Cindy.
Thank you. Thank you for doing this work, Katie. It's a lot of work. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.